Hi everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. I'm Frater Eleftheria, and well, it's been about a week since I did my book launch on a live stream for the Voces Caelesti, and I'm happy to say it was well received and got some book sales from that. And thank you to those of you who have already bought the book. Thank you for those of you who attended the live stream to support me. If you haven't already got a copy of that, I'll leave a link below where you can purchase your own copy. And if you haven't seen it already, this is what it looks like. And actually, this just arrived in the mail today for me. First time I've actually held a non-proof physical copy of the book, and it's just incredible. And you can also get it in hardcover. So check out the link below anyway, and just also make sure that you check that you're going to the Amazon website of your own particular country, so you don't get hit with ridiculous shipping costs or something like that. Yeah, so for those who maybe haven't seen one of my videos for a while or haven't seen anything from the mailing list, this is your reminder that the Voces Caelesti is out, and please go buy a copy if you're interested. In that live stream, I touched upon a couple of themes around the times that we're living in now and the reason why this book is needed. You know, it's hard to really cover everything in a lot of depth in a hour and 20-minute stream. So there's more that I feel I need to explain about that, particularly since it's becoming more and more apparent that we are living in very unusual times, living in an ending of a time, an ending of a civilization even, which is why a book like this is needed at this time. So I want to explain a bit more about that. I'm sure that if you are already following this channel, you don't really need any convincing to see that there's something really wrong with the present society, and it seems to be on its way out. We seem to be in a Kali Yuga type of a phase of society where the old is collapsing. But it's true, and perhaps if you've never heard that before, it's shocking to you. So I want to just explain why I believe that is the case in very great detail. And then I want to explain why I think none of the existing avenues for a solution to the current problems that our civilization faces are satisfactory, and thus something like the Voces Caelesti and the approach to entering the new world that it gives forth is something that is actually needed, something that doesn't currently exist. And as we navigate this perilous journey that we're all going through, from the ending of the old world and the rebirth into the new earth, we need something that can help us to navigate that stage in history. And that's what this book is designed to be, among other things. So that's what I'm going to explain more about tonight. So to start off with, we need to diagnose the present state of our society, particularly Western society, but since everything is so globally interconnected, it really relates to the whole world, because whatever happens to the West will have flow-on effects to the rest of the world. So the first thing that we need to realize is that our present society is in decline. Been in decline since around 2008, although the root causes that gave rise to the decline have been in place for many decades before that. I'm a millennial. I remember what the world was like before the decline started, and as you know, one of the elders apparently of the new generation, not a young man anymore, I can vouch for the fact that the world was a certain way 20 years ago that is different to how it is now. And I can vouch for the fact that the 90s and the noughties were in many respects better than the current state of affairs. People were better off, people were happier, people were more social, society was just more functional. And what really started the process of the decline was the global financial crisis of around 2008, when the whole economic system crashed. And the reason for that was because we had had decades of neoliberalism where there was very little regulation, and the banks and the corporations and the finance industry could do whatever they want and grow the economy by speculating on things and moving fake money around. And that bubble burst, and the whole system imploded on itself. And there were all these defaults on debts, and a lot of people lost a lot of money. But the banks, the big banks that were responsible for the crisis, were bailed out by the government. So the free market didn't apply when it came to the government saving financial institutions that had been shown by that very market to be defective and no longer relevant. Rather than using that crisis as an opportunity to recalibrate and come up with a new form of economics that could again restart forward progress for humanity, we just propped up a failed system. It was ordinary people that bore the cost of that. And we had the introduction of austerity capitalism, so-called, where everyone, except for the very rich, of course, were told to tighten their belts and pay for the crisis, the difficult economic times that had come about as a result of the global financial crisis. We couldn't address the underlying problem that gave rise to the crisis because the institutions that were responsible for the crisis had too much power to actually be held to account for what they had done to the economy. And so business as usual continued, and the bankers and the financial sector escaped all accountability. And then, in the years that followed, they tried to convince us that there was a recovery of sorts, that the economy was picking up again, but actually it's never been the same since the crash, since the global financial crisis. Ever since that point, services haven't been what they were, everywhere has been understaffed, everybody has been underpaid, and the situation has only gotten worse, really. People are struggling more and more. So the so-called recovery hasn't really been a recovery at all for the majority of people. Their financial situation just continues to worsen. And really, the worsening of the situation for the majority of people really began with the beginning of the neoliberal economic system, which was a real triumph for big business and represented a new era where things like the workers' movement didn't exercise as much power as they used to, and government was not able to rein in private business, private corporations as much as it used to be able to, which was another lever by which the people could kind of make sure that their interests were being taken into account to some extent. And so what you saw was the amount of money that these corporations were making going up and up and up, and inflation going up and up and up as the economy grew, and more money was printed, but real wages moving up very little. The cost of assets going up, wages going up very little. There has been this growing divide between the very rich and everybody else. And the rest of us have just been getting poorer and poorer and poorer. And the global financial crisis was a real flashpoint for that process and kind of another dramatic acceleration of that process. COVID was, of course, another big kick in the guts for our civilization. And it represented another big transfer of wealth from all of us to the very rich, who already had more than they would ever need, while the rest of us struggle just to make ends meet, or those of us who are better off making ends meet but can't ever get ahead. What we have is a continuous impoverishing of the general population by a parasitic ruling class. And that means that there's less people with secure housing. That means there's less people starting families. Population replacement isn't what it should be. And we're just getting worked harder and harder for less and less. And people are just starting to give up. During that period of that event from 2020 that I talked about, a couple of years into that, we got this phenomenon of quiet quitting, where people were so stressed with how the world was and how there was nothing to accommodate them from society, even though they were doing it tougher, nothing from their jobs or anything else, that they began quiet quitting, which is basically they had the intention of quitting their job but couldn't at the time, so they just checked out mentally and just put no effort into their job at all because they didn't see themselves getting enough of a return on that. And I feel like since then, the quiet quitting has just continued indefinitely. No one's motivated to do their jobs anymore, to participate in society anymore. And we've had about 20 years of anytime you call on the phone, it's like we're experiencing an unexpectedly high volume of calls. We're understaffed. We'll get to you shortly. But if it happens for 20 years, it's not unexpected, is it? It's the new norm. It's just that nobody wants to admit that the standards have dropped in our society and the standards have become so low. And it's just little things like that indicate a decline. All of the urban spaces that are becoming abandoned, and the urban decay that results, the boarded up shops because rent has become too expensive and nothing new opening. All of this is symptomatic of decline. The social strife that we continuously see, rises in antisocial behaviour and crimes, all symptomatic of decline. And economic factors like this are indeed one of the things that can cause a social decline and eventually collapse. Other events that can collapse a civilization include an environmental crisis, declining birth rates for whatever reason, the consequences that flow from mass migration, and having incompetent political leadership. And of course, these are all features of modern Western society, and any one of them could lead to a collapse. We are on track for decline and eventual collapse of the current society that we live in. That sounds like it's something that's alarming. It's actually an opportunity to create a better world, and not as scary as we might think from all of the fear corn about post-apocalyptic dystopias that we see in the media. So just stay with me on that. I'll get back to that. But first, let's just look at whether there's any prospect of the current system being capable of escaping the eventual collapse. Not only do I think that our current political leadership and our current economic ruling class aren't capable enough to stop it, I actually think that they have no plan to improve things for the vast majority of people. Every decision that they make only makes things worse for us and enriches them at the expense of us, and it's by design. I actually think that they want to disenfranchise us completely, maybe even get rid of us permanently. I mean, look at the relentless drive to build data centres everywhere to replace us. And what are they going to do with the useless eaters once they've got AI doing most things for them and people aren't working anymore and doing anything that the economy deems productive? Look at the way they talk about us in the Epstein files, the way that Epstein emailed Bill Gates about how maybe we should get rid of poor people altogether. I think that you'd find that's a surprisingly common attitude among that strata. And you look at the way that they're building bunkers everywhere. They're planning to F off when society goes down, when the ship goes down. They've got no intention of helping us. They're just going to leave us to fend for ourselves. Actually, they'll be getting out of our hair and allowing us to build something better than the crap prison planet that they presided over. But in their own mind, they're escaping a sinking ship. But you know, one thing that is important to keep in mind is that at any point in history, when the leaders start to retreat to their bunkers, that is not a signal of strength, that is a signal of weakness. It shows that they recognize that their established order is coming to an end, they can't do anything to stop it, and they're just retreating into their little bunker to preserve their own life and their whatever little bit of power and control they can hold on to for as long as possible. When you look at the movie Downfall, that wasn't a story about the Austrian painter at the height of his power. It was about the Austrian painter being backed into a corner by the Allies and being on the brink of defeat. So I think the bunkers that the elites are building are symbolic that they know that they will soon be in a similar position. I don't want to be too optimistic about that, because I don't want people to become complacent and think that the new earth is just going to come about all by itself, but that's the way that I see things. Political leaders, the leaders in big business and elsewhere, they've already thrown us under the bus. They've already decided they don't care about us. They're going to steal as much of our wealth from us as they possibly can, get as close as they can to making us own nothing and them own everything, and then they're going to try and get rid of us. Whether that's by separating themselves from us and leaving us to our fate, or imprisoning us in minute cities, or simply getting rid of us. So that's their attitude. That's the attitude that they've chosen to take. So we have no choice but to look for alternatives. And so the sooner that we realize that the current society has got nothing to offer us in the future, and we owe it nothing because it's given us nothing for what we've put into it, the better. And the sooner we realize that, the sooner we can start to build the alternative to the current system. And we have a better chance of implementing it effectively because we take more time to do that. So what choices do we have? We need to build an alternative to the current society that's unavoidable, and the collapse is more or less inevitable. So what are our choices? Well, we can continue to go on as usual, which, as I've just outlined, isn't really an option because they're going to come to an end one way or the other, unless our leaders take some bold actions, which I don't think is going to happen. They've shown no indication that they intend to do that at all, which leaves either trying to revolutionize society at the grassroots level, so having a political revolution that seizes power, or waiting for the collapse and then leaving the cities and going and building alternative communities in a more decentralized way that's not quite as sophisticated as industrial society at its peak, but at least is an attempt at rebuilding society in some other way, given the catastrophic failure that our current society is heading towards. And I don't think AI will save them, and I don't think that their agenda to create cities that people are trapped in, where everybody has a social credit score and everyone has a digital ID and everybody has a digital currency that can be taken away at a moment's notice. I don't think that that system is going to work for them. I don't think that they will be able to address the underlying problems and weaknesses of their society enough to prevent the collapse. I think that people will reject that prison system, that prison society that they're trying to build. The signs that we've seen already, enough people will reject that agenda for it to not be tenable for them to be able to bring it about. But if we wanted to challenge the powers that are trying to bring about this unsatisfactory future, be it by continuing business as usual or creating their panopticon prison society, what are our options for opposing that politically? So you've got the centre, which is the status quo, which is pushing us towards that outcome. So that's obviously not an option. And more people are realising that. And that's why there's a political polarisation in our society towards the radical left and the radical right. And neither of those options are good either. Neither of those movements is going to take us into a brighter future if they manage to seize power. So on the one hand, you've got the far left, which really, the old far left, which was like anarchist punks and trade unionists and anti-globalization protesters who were protesting against the World Economic Forum rather than simping for it and its agenda. That far left is gone. And what we have in place of that is the so-called woke left. And really, this is a movement which is utterly destructive and corrosive to any functional society. And to some extent, this was always the plan of certain elements of the far left, the postmodernists who were really a development out of communism, but focused on cultural change rather than economic change. It's not a good ideology. It's a really toxic ideology. So they will support any cause that they see as an avenue for destroying and undermining those groups that they hate. And so that is what their ideology is based around. And so it can never build anything. It can only corrupt and destroy. And what that means ultimately is it will weaken society to a point where it can be overtaken by other ideologies and other belief systems, which will take us in a worse direction, will create a worse society than what we have now, what the Western liberal order has been able to create. To pursue the far left as it exists today and their goals for society, if they got everything they wanted, then the civilization would cease to exist within a generation. Society would just die off within a generation. So that's not an option. And it's hateful anyway. So why would we want people like that in power anyway? So that's off the table. What about the far right? Well, again, that is a monstrous option. There's a real prospect that the far right could take power with the promise of fixing the society that we live in that is clearly broken. What they will install in place of the current society is another authoritarian power structure. You will have a system of complete control down to every little decision that you make in your personal life. You won't be able to choose what thoughts you have. You won't be able to choose maybe even who you're allowed to marry and have children with. You might not be allowed to practice certain religions. You might not be allowed to read certain books. In fact, certain books will definitely be banned. It is an authoritarian statist system. Coming to power would represent a retreat back into tribalism. And there are some people that say that is inevitable because we have introduced elements into our society now that are tribalistic and always will be and will refuse to be anything but that. And so in order to preserve what we do have that is good, we need to become more tribalistic in turn. But when we take that to an extreme, we risk losing the very things that made the Western model of civilization, the kind of classical liberal Western order, such an appealing form of society. All of the freedoms, all of the openness to difference and finding ways of making that work for us and integrating everything in a functional way, like all of that will be lost and it'll just be us versus them, which is a regression from what we are now. So that is not an alternative either. So in other words, there is no political alternative, at least not one that exists now. Everything that exists now is part of the old order and will probably collapse with it, which means we need to look outside the existing options. we need to think about building something new. In some ways, it's still impossible to know just what the alternative will be, because we still need to invent it. It's not something that exists, and that's not something that comes down to one person and what they think needs to happen. It's a collective effort. It's a discussion that we all have to have amongst ourselves, and we all have to come to agreement in a democratic fashion as to what we think that should be. Having said that, I think observing the way that things have gone, and things that have gone wrong, and things that can help us to rebuild if we can reclaim them, by looking at all that, we can put down some fundamentals of what the change has to look like, what the alternative that we build has to look like. So first and foremost, the alternative that we're building can't be something destructive, just looking at what we want to destroy and overthrow, but it has to be constructive. We have to build something, and something that can serve as an alternative civil society for people, given that our leaders have broken the social contract with us and rendered the current civil society null and void. So the first thing that is important is community. We need to build proper communities again. And that's not something we have right now. Communities have been eroded. All the associations that people used to join, for the most part, aren't a feature anymore. Family has been hugely eroded by modern society. Religious communities are not as prevalent. People spend more time online instead of talking face to face with real people. We're just more atomized against other people. And so all of this means that we've lost that community that we used to have. Extended family is something we've lost as well. So the first thing we need to do is realize that we need to get our communities back. We need to remember that family is important. And if you come from a family full of narcissists or something like that, you can create your own family based on the people that are close to you in your life. And I like your family, but you need to have your people around you. You need to have a tribe. You need to have a village around you where people can cooperate with each other. And, we need to have neighborhoods where people cooperate with each other. People know their neighbors, and, and we need to, we need to not be afraid of borrowing things or lending things to people in our community, helping our community out, trading things with people in a way that becomes the basis of mutual exchange and a sort of alternative economy later on, giving people help and support when they need it to get on their feet when society won't give them any support whatsoever. All of those things are important for building communities back up, because that community will become the basis of the alternative. And that ability to build community will be where the change really begins. Even though our existing communities have been eroded, we now have an opportunity to build new communities that have been optimized for the regeneration of civilization. So that means, really learning to help each other out again, and building those communities around a care and compassion for one another that is deep and genuine. And there is a theme that runs through the Voces Caelesti, which is all about the law of love, particularly in the division known as values. It talks a lot about the law of love and how love is more than just an emotion between human beings. It's actually almost like a universal principle of things being drawn together into a greater whole. And because the divine operates through interconnectivity, we see this drawing together of people. We see that the most favorable conditions for beings, animals, organisms, anything to operate under is this uniting into greater and greater wholes and cooperating with each other for bigger and bigger goals. From the way that smaller cells united into bigger cells, and then cells united into multicellular organisms, human beings came along and became the dominant species by being incredibly cooperative and building strong communities. And the way that the more successful societies that humanity built were ones where there was more unification between people and were founded upon that compassion, with Christian civilization being the exemplar of that. We always see that the universe selects cooperation and compassion as the way that people flourish, by creating systems and societies around that. That's how they flourish. So that's what we need to do again, beginning at a community level. And those individual bonds that we build at the community level, it seems small, it doesn't seem like a big societal change, but it's actually incredibly important, because our ability to form those bonds at that level will determine the integrity of the entire society. It's like a building. If you have a house that's built that has a few engineering quirks that mean that it's not exactly the most structurally sound, you can do renovations to change that and modify it and correct the flaw. But if you use a building material like bricks that are too weak because they haven't been fired the right way so that the molecules don't bond together effectively. If you don't have the right building materials, then that leads to a rapid deterioration in the quality of the building and will cause such deep-seated problems that the whole thing needs to be demolished and rebuilt again. So it completely compromises the building. So that is the importance of those intimate personal relationships, those local communities, and really having strong bonds at that level and not being an individualistic culture. And collapsing societies with a high level of cohesion and continuity at the grassroots level of the general culture have a better ability to bounce back from such a collapse. The big ruling structures of the society collapse, the established order collapses, but some amount of community is able to be maintained because it was already strong to begin with. And so that's the level of culture. And culture is actually hugely important, not only for giving us a sense of identity and purpose and allowing us to live as functional human beings. A particular type of culture can change an entire political system without a single coup d'etat. Just if the culture within which the institutions of a society operate changes, then they're forced to adapt to that. And to what extent the institutions are able to function as intended can be determined largely by the culture, by the whims of the culture. So building the right type of culture is extremely important. And so we need to be thinking about building a new type of culture and which can present an alternative vision of society from that level of communities out. And we need to start thinking about what we want to base that culture on. But you know, if we're able to avert complete collapse because there's some kind of radical change that happens in society among people to change the structures of society before it can collapse, then in order to make that happen, we again need to be able to build strong communities. Because to be able to do that, historically, for people to be able to overthrow a corrupt system like that, they need to be able to organize collectively and create their own alternative political organizations that can take over running society before they then overthrow the existing ruling structures. So again, building communities and a sense of solidarity between people and cooperation between people will be the essential first step. But what should we build such communities around? What should we build such an alternative culture around? Will any philosophy at all do, or should it have a basis in a specifically religious or spiritual worldview? Let's explore that a bit more. So the only alternative really to building an alternative culture around something religious or spiritual is to make it atheistic and secular. And we've had a chance to look at how societies that are completely secular, completely materialistic, track. We attempted it with communism, and the result was untold human suffering and the reduction of people to just a statistic, and the devaluing of human life and the dehumanization of people by taking away their individuality and treating anything that brought beauty into the world or innovation into the world as just a bourgeois deviation, which didn't have a strict productive function and therefore had no value. So it created a very depressing world, and it created untold human suffering. 100 million people dead because of that system. And you know, this whole racing towards AI and having a system run by AI is going to do the same thing again. We are taking all of the soul out of society. We're taking the human spirit out completely and making it something completely cold and mechanical. So of course we're going to be dehumanized by that. If we're subsumed into a system like that, we will lose our humanity and we will lose our agency. And so we can't allow that to happen. And so what these systems fail to understand is that there is something to the human experience beyond just material needs. And if you deny that, then you deny something fundamental about the human experience, and you ultimately deny a person's humanity. But in order to understand what that is, you need to venture into the unseen parts of what motivate or influence us, which inevitably gets you into a discussion on the spiritual. So despite what people like Sam Harris say about being able to extrapolate higher values and morals from logical reasoning and what is functional and what is beneficial from an evolutionary standpoint, it's not always the case. that that's the way that morality works. So we need to have a spiritual understanding, and we need to have a spiritual basis, therefore, of this alternative culture that we need to build. And the Voces Caelesti talks about some of these themes as well, and maybe I'll put some references or quotations on the screen, but it talks about how the origins of morality are at the spiritual level of our being, the level of soul, from the parts of our own being that belong to the divine, not to the physical world. And there's also an idea communicated in the division known as the covenant, which is that society's temples are its souls. A society's temples represent its soul, and without that, society has no soul, and it is necessary to restore the soul of society. So quite a powerful notion there. And of course, another big advantage of having spiritual belief system and a spiritual story as the basis of a new community or a new culture is that it roots that culture and ultimately the society that the culture produces in something that is transcendent and eternal, something which therefore is able to outlast even the greatest of empires, which base themselves on the notions of the world and what is important to the world. And I'll put some references up in the Voces Caelesti that talk about that as well. So we need to have some spiritual or religious basis for the alternative communities, the alternative culture that we build to reinvigorate civilization. So what options do we have? Well, in the Western world, it'll probably be a similar story, a similar parallel with the religions in other societies as well. But in the Western world, we have Christianity. The most immediate thing that we could do is a return to Christianity and to reverse the hemorrhaging of people attending church that, up until the last few years was a continuous trend for about 100 years. And even though we have had a rise in people going back to church in recent years, I think that is more a social and political reaction to things than a lasting return to faith. And in any case, I don't think that Christianity will last. I think that it will continue to decline, and I think that it will not disappear entirely necessarily, but disappear as a force in society that can exert an influence on the culture and what we believe. It will be one sect among many that isn't really taken seriously. So it will fade into irrelevancy, and the reason for that is because in this age of ours where we have more knowledge and more understanding of more things, we can see that there's actually a lot of contradictions and flaws in Christianity that can't be ignored once they've been brought to the surface. Ultimately, that's going to be the thing that causes people to leave. There's loads of examples that I could use, but just as one example, there's this idea of hell in the Bible, and we need to be saved from hell, and we'll go to hell if we don't follow this particular church. But then people rightly ask, what kind of a loving God could create a place like hell? And why would a God make it so that you can't actually be saved until Jesus comes into the world quite late in the piece? And then there's no proof whatsoever that such a place exists based on our current understanding of science. And it's not even in the Bible, so if you read scriptures carefully. So there's just all these little things where if you look at it closely enough, it starts to unravel. It all starts to fall apart when you start to examine it. And that's only going to continue as time goes on and knowledge continues to circulate through the world. And Christianity has helped us immensely to move past the barbarism of our pagan past. But now we're reaching a point where we have advanced so far that we have outgrown even Christianity. And so if we continue to follow it, it will just be pulling us back. And we advanced very far indeed before the collapse began. And that's the way that civilization works. It peaks and then suddenly and dramatically starts to decline. And that's what we're seeing. And the decline in Christianity is a part of that. But now we can do better, and we can create a culture around a spiritual philosophy that is fit for our own times. And that is what the Voces Caelesti attempts to do. It could serve as that new philosophy, or at the very least, it could start the conversations that people need to have to be able to influence the development of such a philosophy, of such a spiritual philosophy. It does so without completely throwing the past away. The Voces Caelesti recognizes the value of the past, and even though humanity moves through a sequence of ages or aeons, it doesn't present the view that other religious traditions present, that the old must be completely destroyed by the new, but rather the new builds upon the foundations set by the old, like sediments of rock forming one on top of the other. And so the newer sediment, the newer layer of rock, obscures all the others beneath it, but it relies on them to be propped up. And so we can develop our traditions in a new direction that better serves us while still honouring them. And that's something that a philosophy like Thelema, for example, doesn't seem to grasp. They can't even acknowledge Christ as one of the great magi. They say it's Dionysus instead. So it's a very immature view of the past aeons. And the philosophy that's set out in the Voces Caelesti tries to take a more mature view that allows us to take things with us as we transition into the new aeon that might actually still be of value to us. Because that's another thing that we need to realize, is that the collapse of a society does not mean oblivion. That's the thing that comes into everyone's mind. When the collapse happens, it's going to be like Mad Max or The Road or something like that. When in fact, that's not actually what happens in a collapse. Often what happens is all of the urban centers start to really, really suck, and people start to leave the cities and go out into regional areas and build alternative societies and communities which are more agrarian and a simpler way of living, but more decentralized as well, and freer to some extent. And then life goes on and things continue to progress. We've been fed this lie by secularism that the Dark Ages was like, you know, you had Roman progress here and then Rome fell and then progress fell off. We flatlined for 1,000 years and then we could start to progress again. But that's not actually what happened. We continued to have advances in technology, we continued to have advances in education, and we were able to draw upon the knowledge of the past that didn't just completely disappear. It was always preserved in some form somewhere. And so the scientific knowledge we have will be preserved in some form, and we'll be able to rebuild from that. I think there's lots of reasons to be hopeful about a post-collapse world. And in fact, you know, it could be solar punk, it could be the new earth. And the thing that the Voces Caelesti teaches is that far from natural selection being this brutal thing that's about survival of the fittest, it's the opposite, that the divine order itself, that nature itself will select those communities where there is the most love and empathy and bonding and compassion and cooperation between the most number of people. Those are the forms of social organization that will succeed. And even if there's some ecological aspect to the collapse, that doesn't concern me either. You know, human beings are very resilient. We survived the Ice Age with virtually no technology. So I have no doubt, I've got every confidence that we will be able to survive whatever is around the corner for us. Not only survive, but eventually even thrive in a new kind of society. And it's important that we take the time now to determine what principles that new society is going to be built around. And so I want to create a bit of hope that we can do that and that we are doing that. Hope is another thing that the Voces Caelesti gives us. That's another important message of that book. It presents a kind of defiant hope which is hopeful even if there is uncertainty about success or failure of the human race. And there's a line in there which, to paraphrase, says that if you're wrong about the future being hopeful, then who will tell you you are wrong in a land of skulls? If we're all going to die and you get it wrong, you say, no, things are going to be fine, who will be left to denounce you? So you might as well be as hopeful as you can be. And hope is its own reward. Hope is actually, in a kind of process of self-fulfilling prophecy, is part of the solution as well, part of the thing that gets us over the line to that new world. And I just want to leave you with this, because there was some research that was done relatively recently about the power of positive self-affirmation. And if we give ourselves positive self-talk, it actually restructures our brain and it gives us more sense of self-worth, a greater sense of well-being overall. It makes us more resilient to external challenges, more motivated and more wired for success. And the effects of that positive self-talk are long-lasting. They're not just for a few hours or something. So if we want the best possible chance of building that new world, we need that hope. We need to kindle that powerful hope. So let's do it. Let's adopt a belief system. Let's adopt beliefs in our lives that give us that hope. So that was a big topic, but I hope that I have demonstrated all the reasons why we need a new approach when we're thinking about the solution to today's existential problems, particularly the fact that the society that we know is collapsing. And also I hope I've covered some of the ways that the Voces Caelesti offers an approach that doesn't currently exist, which will start to take us in a good direction for coming up with some real solutions, real ways of regenerating civilization in its new chapter, and some of the ways that it motivates us to rise to meet those problems. And if you want to learn more and you want to read more, then please buy a copy of the Voces Caelesti. The link again will be in the description below, and I think that you will be greatly rewarded. If these are questions that you have been thinking about in your own life, I think that this book will encourage you to think about those differently and perhaps give you some of the answers that you're seeking. So go check it out. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe to my channel to support my work, hit the notification bell so you actually get notified of new videos when they arrive. Hit join or thanks down below, and please also do join my mailing list, which will be linked in the description below as well. And I did an interview with Sean Atwood recently on his podcast. You can check it out in my live videos. But thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.